For this last nutrition lecture, we're going to touch on some issues of hunger and the global environment. And these issues are constantly changing. All you need to do is pull up some news articles to see that issues, political issues, starvation, famine, these things afflict different areas in different ways all the time. But there are some definite trends we can refer to when we look at the realm of nutrition. Approximately 1 in every 5 people worldwide experiences persistent hunger. And this is the idea that they chronically experience the need for nourishment that they're not getting, and they experience the pain and the illness and the weakness that comes along with not getting those nutritional needs satisfied. And those numbers actually are probably higher than that now. The world population is still relatively exploding. It's gone from 6 to 7 billion people now. And with advents of famines, crop failures, earthquakes, storms, a lot of places don't have the infrastructure to support people that otherwise wouldn't go hungry if there was a natural disaster. And sadly, what we see is up to 80% of hungry children live in countries that actually produce a surplus of food. The fact that so many people go hungry has less to do with our ability as a people to produce food and more of an issue with our ability as a people to get along, to have good public policy, civil war outbreaks. It's not always necessarily like a famine or the inability to produce food. We can get food and supplies to the Antarctic, to the North Pole. We can get things anywhere in this world, and we can produce massive quantities of food, but we can't always get it to the people who need it because of political reasons. Consequences of hunger, and a lot of this is pretty self-explanatory, makes sense, especially in children. If you don't meet your nutritional needs, especially when you're young, you're going to see higher rates of infant mortality, protein, energy malnutrition, so you're going to see stunted growth, iron deficiency, increased susceptibility to different diseases, inability to walk or stand, and premature death. A lot of children die every year just because of the fact that they're not getting their basic nutritional needs met. So it's a direct link between hunger and life expectancy. Again, today the total world food supply, there's plenty of stores left over from every harvest. So there's enough food to feed the people of the world at any given time, but it's just how do we distribute those foods and how do we get them to the people that need them? Those are the greatest challenges that we have to overcome. So some of the worldwide challenges we see, and I'm sure you've heard about these in high school classes too. There's a lot of push with environmental studies to teach about poor crop productivity as a result of not using land in a sustainable way. A lot of countries where there is abject poverty, farmers are not thinking about the best ways to put the land to use for sustainability. They do a lot of slash and burn of forests, which if you do that and lose the root structure, you're going to have massive erosion over time. And that crop productivity will decrease greatly after just a few years and never regain itself. So with the desertification of certain lands, poor infrastructure for water supply, changes in the climate, droughts, floods, increase in air pollution, we have all these environmental challenges that just compound the challenge to grow food and also to get it to the people that we need. And like I mentioned, deforestation, desertification, pollution, extinction of species. People who are starving or are have food insecurity are not thinking about these issues in their farming practices and in their acquiring food practices, so they tend to be harder on the environment. It makes sense. I'm not thinking about global warming when my children are starving. I'm thinking about how do I get them that next meal. So we need to look as a world at not only how do we get the food we do produce to the people who need it, but also how do these areas where these people are experiencing water shortages or desertification, how do we implement good long-term sustainable land use practices so that they can be self-sufficient and sustainable as well. And again, hunger is just that chronic painful sensation when you don't have enough food available. It results in severe deficiencies of vitamins and minerals. About 40% of the world's population has some form of hunger in some degree. I mean, that's about 2 billion people. That's significant. One thing to note that I think is interesting, it's mostly women and children. When you look at hunger worldwide, even in the United States, mainly the people who suffer from it are women and children. And some of that has to do with women tend to be the person who takes on the role of being the single parent in a single parent household, so they're more likely to live in poverty with children. Children obviously are limited in their ability to find food resources, to work, to get the help that they need. So it makes sense that children would be the ones that suffer as well. But in some countries, the role of women is very differently defined than it is in the United States. In some countries, women have no rights. They can't have property rights. They can't drive cars. They're discouraged from getting educated. They're not allowed to go to school. They're basically considered property of their father until they get married and have a spouse. And so with that second-class status in life, if their spouse dies or doesn't provide for them or limits their resources, they don't have much recourse. So women and children tend to be the ones that suffer the most from hunger and poverty, more so than men. In developed countries, the primary cause of hunger is food poverty. And that's not, again, not necessarily an issue of lack of resources being around there. It's just that people make poor choices that lead them to not having the food resources and the nutritional food resources that they should have. Really, when you look at other countries, a lot of third world nations, they literally lack access to food. Whereas in the United States or other developed countries, it's more of an issue of abuse of drugs and alcohol, physical illness, depression, lack of awareness of different food programs that might be available, or maybe a reluctance to accept government handouts or charity. So like when you look in the United States, there's a wide variety of food programs, both private and public food programs, but not everybody gets them. And so it's not necessarily an issue of availability, but it's more an issue of, you know, if they're on drugs and alcohol, or they have a mental or physical illness, they're not getting themselves those resources. Food insecurity, it's not always easy to recognize. So I put this chart in here, and you should ask yourself these questions. I actually had friends in college that experienced this, and being college-age students, money is always tight, and I'm sure you may have experienced this, or you know people that do. Just the nature of being in school lends to the idea that money is tight. You're spending money on school. You're not spending as much time as you could working. You're trying to better your life or get a different career. So that means whatever career or job you have right now is probably you're not making as much as you'd like. So you might fall into one of these categories, or at least know somebody who does. And you know, do you often go hungry? Do you have too little food to eat because you had to use your money for something else, or feed your children instead of yourself, or you don't have money for transportation to get that food? Do you ever rely on friends or neighbors for a meal? Do your children complain about being hungry? These are issues you see with food insecurity. So it's not necessarily that you're going hungry all the time, but food insecurity refers to this idea that you kind of don't know where your next meal is going to come from. And a lot of people, even in the United States, live this way today. They rely on other people or other resources for their food, and there's not much in their cupboard to get them by day to day. With that being said, the U.S. does have some significant food programs, and I've mentioned these before. About 1 in every 6 Americans receive some sort of assistance of some kind for food, and these numbers are actually much higher as of the recording of this lecture. They change so frequently. I don't test on statistics for that reason, because they are constantly changing. But to have a sense of some of the food programs is a good idea for test questions. But not, don't worry about statistics on numbers. That's just, it's so fluctuating that it varies so much. I think right now it's about 48 million people that are using food stamps, or the SNAP program. And you know, anytime you're in a recession or there's no jobs, you're going to see these numbers go up. Some of the U.S. food programs include, as I've mentioned before, the WIC program for women, infants, and children. Also, the SNAP program, which is the newer version of the food stamp program. There are elder care and child care programs like Head Start programs where they provide meals. There are free and reduced lunches at public schools. A lot of kids will get their breakfast and their lunch at school, sometimes even an after-school snack. And if you meet a limited income requirement, you can qualify for those. And there's also congregate meals, the Salvation Army will always do their Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner. And then there's Meals on Wheels programs. A lot of charity groups will do Meals on Wheels programs as well as communities. And this is a little bit of review. WIC is effective at improving the health of mothers and infants. So for better or worse, from a public policy issue, from a nutritional standpoint, again, there's no greater time for nutritional needs than when you are a fetus and an infant and a pregnant woman. So, and these windows of opportunity for good health will close rapidly, and you can't get those opportunities back to eat well, and you can have long-term lifetime issues if you don't. So, the WIC program really probably does reduce overall health costs over a lifetime by providing those resources to children and women. And again, I mentioned the food stamp program. Now it's depending on the state you live in, it's some sort of EBT card or a SNAP card, or I know in Wisconsin they call it the Badger card after the Badgers. Every state has a little bit different way that they distribute it. It's administered and sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA. And like I said, my stats are a little old here. These were from just before this Great Recession. More than 20 million people. At the time of this recording, it was closer to 50 million people. So it's gone up significantly from just even a few years ago. The challenge with this, though, is whatever this number is, over half the recipients are kids. So when you have this situation where you have a huge population on food stamps and over half are children, that creates a dilemma in and of itself. Reforming it or changing policy is not necessarily the solution to this problem. You've got kids who can't go get a job, and maybe their parents are having issues themselves. It's very difficult to resolve these issues, and these issues are going to be issues that plague our society for a long time. How do we deal with making sure everybody gets good nutrition? There's also food recovery programs that have made a dramatic differences. Food banks will collect and distribute food. These are places that will take non-perishable items that will help distribute food to the hungry. Same thing with food pantries. These are your typical, local food shelves. They'll collect food and provide groceries to be prepared at home by people. So people will come and get these at the food shelf and take them home. And then there's emergency kitchens, and these are on-site locations where people will actually come to eat. They're often called soup kitchens. This is where somebody can come and actually get a hot meal. So if they're homeless or they live in a place where they don't have access to a kitchen to cook their food, if they're living out of their car or living out of a friend's house, they can also go to an emergency kitchen to get assistance as well. So what is the state of world hunger? And again, my stats are always changing. 1/5 of the world's 6 billion people have no land or no possessions at all. Again, I think we just recently topped 7 billion people. So when you look at statistically, the poorest of the poor survive on less than $1 each day. They lack safe water to drink. They cannot read or write. A lot of these areas, about 80% of all that they earn is spent on food, and they're still hungry and malnourished. So there's places in the world where there's so much food insecurity and there's so much of a lack of infrastructure that most of their money is actually going to food. I found this stat interesting. The average house cat eats twice as much protein every day as some of these people. So think about that. The yearly cost of keeping a cat is greater than that person's annual income. And a lot of this ties back to, like I mentioned earlier, public policy, the government structure in place. If people can own their own land and run their own businesses, produce their own crops, if there's some autonomy and liberty in the society, the society typically flourishes. When you look at these societies that are run in a totalitarian state or some sort of communistic state, people tend to starve to death. Under Stalin's regime in Russia, millions and tens of millions of Russians starved to death under communism. It was all a facade that communism was working, and all these people died. No doubt about it, in the United States, we definitely have our issues, but as a whole, what qualifies somebody at the poverty level, they qualify for housing, air conditioning. A lot of people that are considered at the poverty level have access to internet, a TV, have access to food resources. Again, not everybody gets those because of mental illness issues or drug abuse issues. But when you look at the conditions in which some people live in other third world countries, I would rather be poor in the United States than be poor in, somewhere in Southeast Asia or some African desert field. It's just there's no infrastructure there to support the safety and the needs of those people. Um, so so that the infrastructure in the United States, even though we have our issues with hunger and food insecurity, there are resources in place. A lot of these countries don't have any sort of social welfare program. They don't have Social Security. They don't have Medicare. They don't have Medicaid. More developed countries, at least there are some of those options. So why do we have this state of world hunger? Again, like I mentioned, some of it is infrastructure, some of it is access, but a lot of the food source, we see it most when a famine will hit, if a crop fails, some sort of natural disaster will cause a famine. But the reason that third world countries struggle so much from this is because they don't have those links. They don't have the infrastructure to get them the food that they need. But really, when you see social issues and political issues really get involved, a good example was back in the early 1990s in Somalia. The civil war of the United States was dropping aid in Somalia for people who were starving, but a lot of the militants in the civil war were capturing the food. So even if we have the ability to get food to some of these areas, if you have armed conflict, it's very, very difficult, and you see these humanitarian crises happen. At the recording of this lecture, we're right in the middle of a conflict in Syria. Syria has a civil war going on. They have now for a couple of years, and there's tens of millions of refugees. How do you feed all those people that have been displaced? How do you take care of them? So policies, politics, social issues, armed conflict really contribute a lot to hunger. And as I mentioned, natural disasters, food aid from other countries will come in when those crops fail, but if there's issues with the politics of it, you can't get the food in there. And we definitely see hunger and poverty interact with environmental degradation. Like I mentioned, people will often destroy the very resources they need for survival because they're not thinking about next year's crops. They're thinking about food right now. And so as a result, they will erode the land. They will erode their own resources in the pursuit of trying to get something for their family right now. It's human nature. When you are starving, you're not thinking about next year's crop. You're thinking about how do I get food in my belly today. One thing we also see too, not just environmental degradation, but we also see lack of education. People don't recognize that they are destroying the land because they don't know it. They haven't been educated in it. Lack of education often goes along with poverty and hunger. And that makes sense. If you look at it, whether you're looking globally or you're looking at the United States, the more educated you are, the more you are able to get a job, the more able you are to produce an income to support your family, the more knowledgeable you'll be about controlling your family size. Now, when you look at some countries, when you look at a lot of developing nations or third world nations, people will actually look at their family size as a form of security. And so having a lot of children in poverty is a benefit because a lot of them are going to die from a disease or some other cause. And your children are your Social Security. They're your insurance that someone's going to be around to take care of you in your elder years. Other countries don't have the Social Security programs or the Medicaid programs or Medicare programs we have. And so they rely on their children, at least a few of them, to survive, to take care of them in their old age. So hunger and poverty and lack of education actually drive people to have more kids. It sounds very counterintuitive, but with an increase in education, we see poverty and hunger go away, and we also see the size of a family start to be controlled. People tend to become more educated about family size, about controlling birth control options, and we tend to see family size shrink as education increases. And I say that here. As people attain better healthcare and education and family planning, the death rate will begin to fall, and so will the birth rate. So as you start to see fewer and fewer children die, families will start having fewer of them. You're not thinking, well, I got to have 10 kids because only 5 are going to make it, and I need someone to take care of me when I'm older. your children are all surviving, so you tend to have a smaller family size. So improvements in those living standards will help stabilize the population and increase the standard of living and how long people live. Things you can do to save money and to save the environment. These are good things to think about when it comes to nutrition as well. Obviously, recycling is a good thing for the environment. Try to take your bike or walk more. That helps save on the environment, and it also is good for your body. Try and buy things in bulk to save on packaging. Eating at your local farmer market, eating most perishable foods first, and eating lower in the food chain. All of these things, eating in the farmer market and eating the most perishable foods first and eating low on the food chain, those things tend to be the best types of foods for you. If you're eating food that's locally grown, organic-based foods, foods that have not been highly processed, and you're eating lower in the food chain and eating more grains, whole grains, and less of the big, large meat animals. Not that meat's bad for you, but having 5 Big Macs a week is probably not the best thing. And those Big Macs cost a lot more environmentally to produce than the grain that was used to feed the cows. So eating lower on the food chain and eating more locally grown, all of those things help benefit the environment. And they also tend to be nutritionally better for you as well. So it kind of goes hand in hand. You can both save money, protect the environment, and eat healthy if you employ a few of these options as far as how you eat and how you exercise as well. So those are some things to think about when you're thinking about how can I really affect change in my environment and how can I save money and try and eat and live better as well.